The enemy believed this would be another routine conquest. Their empire had expanded for centuries, crushing weaker civilizations under the weight of their war machine. Humanity was just another target, an upstart species barely a blip on the galactic stage. Their fleets descended upon human colonies with the same efficiency they had used countless times before. The first strikes were precise, overwhelming, and absolute. Planets burned, defenses crumbled, and the enemy declared victory before the dust had even settled. But something was wrong. There were no surrender pleas, no desperate negotiations, no frantic attempts to rally. The humans did not respond as expected. No massive counteroffensive, no drawn-out space battles. Just silence. It was as if humanity had simply vanished. The enemy's warlords expected retaliation, but instead, they were met with nothing. It was unsettling. Their experience dictated that an inferior species should either resist in futility or beg for mercy. Humanity did neither. Days turned into weeks, and unease crept into the enemy's ranks. Supply lines began to falter. Equipment failures increased at an alarming rate. Critical starports suffered unexplained blackouts. Military command centers were infiltrated, with security footage showing no one. The enemy's soldiers began whispering rumors, impossible ones. Ships disappearing without a trace. Entire battalions wiped out in their sleep. Generals found dead in their chambers, with no sign of entry. Still, the war machine pressed on, determined to crush whatever remained of human resistance. They deployed more troops, more ships, more resources. But the harder they pushed, the more the cracks in their own foundation began to show. Infighting increased. Logistical nightmares turned small supply shortages into system-wide collapses. Soldiers refused to board ships bound for human-controlled territories. They were not afraid of battle. They were afraid of something else, something unseen. And then came the messages. No demands, no threats, just eerie, cryptic transmissions broadcasted across enemy networks. At first, a few stray words in their native tongue, barely noticeable. Then full sentences, whispered in voices that should not have been possible. We are already here. You were dead the moment you started this war. You fight shadows, and shadows always win. Panic took root. High Command tried to suppress the information, but it was too late. The war they had started was no longer about conquest. It was about survival. And for the first time in their history, they were beginning to understand what true fear felt like. The first deserters were executed, their deaths meant to serve as a warning. Yet, the disappearances continued. Entire squadrons went silent. Warships lost contact mid-transmission, their signals vanishing as if they had never existed. Commanders issued desperate orders for tighter security. More patrols, more surveillance. None of it mattered. The enemy was fighting something they could not see, could not predict, and worst of all, could not understand. Logistics collapsed. Vital supply convoys never arrived. Weapons stockpiles were destroyed from within. Bases left intact one night were nothing but lifeless husks by morning. The few survivors could barely speak. They raved about whispers in the dark, shadows moving where none should be, an overwhelming presence watching them at all times. They were not soldiers anymore. They were prey. The enemy's high command suspected sabotage, but there were no infiltrators, no recorded breaches. It was as if reality itself had turned against them. Communications were filled with static, breaking into warped distortions of human laughter. Attempts to trace the source always led to dead ends. No matter what they did, humanity was always one step ahead, striking where it hurt the most and leaving nothing behind except paranoia and silence. It wasn't just military targets anymore. The chaos had spread beyond the battlefield. Planetary governors turned on one another, accusing subordinates of treason, executing their own officers. Fleets fired upon their allies, convinced they had been compromised. A single rumor could now spark a mutiny. The enemy had once believed war was about strength, about crushing opposition through force and firepower. But humanity had rewritten the rules. This was no longer a war. It was a slow, methodical extermination of everything the enemy had built. And the worst part? The humans never even had to face them directly. The empire was crumbling from the inside, and no one could stop it. The warlords convened in secret, their once mighty empire now unrecognizable. The chaos had spread beyond their fleets, beyond their soldiers. Now entire worlds teetered on the brink of collapse. Trade routes had become death traps, with supply ships vanishing before they could reach their destinations. Civil unrest boiled over as citizens, gripped by fear, turned against their leaders. The enemy had always ruled through dominance, through the certainty that their power was absolute. But now, that certainty was gone. They issued desperate orders: retreat, regroup, reinforce key positions. It made no difference. The moment a fleet tried to pull back, its command structure would break down. Messages between ships were intercepted and replaced with conflicting directives. Some vessels were sent into the void with no destination, their crews never heard from again. Others turned on their own, believing themselves to be compromised. Their forces were still vast, their resources still plentiful, yet none of it mattered. They could not fight what they did not understand. The humans remained unseen, yet their presence was undeniable. One by one, the great warlords fell, not through battle, but through despair. Some took their own lives, unable to bear the weight of their unraveling empire. Others vanished without a trace, their chambers empty, their security systems intact. The remaining leaders, desperate for control, declared martial law across their remaining territories. It was a futile effort. The more they tightened their grip, the faster everything slipped through their fingers. And then, the final blow came. A message, simple yet undeniable, broadcast across every remaining stronghold. You wanted war. This is what war truly is. It was not a surrender demand. It was not a negotiation. It was a statement of fact. The enemy had never been fighting humanity. They had been fighting their own fear, their own crumbling foundation. The war they had wanted was over. Humanity had already won. The silence was worse than defeat. What remained of the enemy's empire was no longer an empire at all, just isolated systems, fractured warbands, and leaders too afraid to speak, let alone command. The once mighty fleets drifted, abandoned by crews who had either fled or succumbed to madness. Planets that had stood for millennia as beacons of their dominance were now husks, their populations paralyzed by fear, waiting for an end that had already come. There were no victorious human armies, no grand fleets claiming the spoils of war. There was only absence, an unrelenting void where the enemy's power had once existed. The few warlords left scrambled to negotiate, to plead, to offer reparations in return for mercy. But there was no response. Humanity did not negotiate with ghosts. Their systems remained dark, their movements unseen, their presence only felt in the growing despair of a race that had already destroyed itself. The final transmissions from high command were disjointed, filled with broken voices and whispered warnings. They spoke of shadows lurking in places they could not reach, of a force that had never truly left them. And then, one by one, the signals stopped. The enemy's once great empire faded into nothing, its people lost to the very terror they had unleashed. Humanity never needed to fire the last shot. The enemy had already done it for them.